So the history and process of designing Clarus Cables goes back to 2002, when I first began working with a Chinese cable factory. And essentially after proving myself to them and solving some production problems, and they knew that I had come from Monster, and they had some level of of confidence in me, I pretty much had the factory at my disposal. And one of the first things that I did was I noticed that they had a lot of different size flat conductors that they had been manufacturing for various projects. And I was very curious about how they would sound. So I made up some interconnects just using a flat conductor, just to get an idea of what a flat conductor sounds like. To go into a little bit of how a cable designer becomes a cable designer, one of the first things you do, generally speaking, is you start to listen to every different possible conductor gauge. And these are going to be round cables, basically, round wires, I should say. And every different gauge has a different tonal balance if you listen to them all. So then what you arrive at, generally speaking, is a multi-conductor cable, such as pretty much everything on the market, where you have a lot of different gauges to carry different frequency ranges or to adjust the tonal balance so that it becomes accurate. So with a flat conductor, what I found was that it reproduced the mid-range better than anything I had ever heard before, but it had pretty much no low frequencies and pretty much no high frequencies. But the mid-range was so good that it really started a thought process in terms of, okay, how can I use this with other types of conductors to get full range instead of just mid-range? The base conductor part was fairly simple because I think pretty much everybody knows, or every cable designer knows, that a large conventional conductor will support low frequencies and reproduce them rather well. So adding some low frequency round solid conductors to the flat conductor gave me bass and mid-range, but relatively little in the way of high frequencies. That pretty much gave me quite a bit of time to think about what's the ideal high-frequency conductor. And generally speaking, people will use very fine gauge conductors for this, but the problem is they all need insulation because you don't want stranded wire in a high-end audio cable. So that's a difficult process to achieve, or to do right, because you have too much insulation in there. So then it occurred to me that since high frequencies travel on the surface of a conductor due to skin effect, the ideal conductor would be just a surface. A thin tube doesn't really work because you can't bend it. And then it occurred to me, and because of being in the wire industry and knowing the trade rather well, I knew of a type of conductor that's largely obsolete today that's generally called Tinsel wire, and it had been used in phone cords back when we had landlines and analog phones that had a coiled cord between the handset and the part that was either sitting on your desk or mounted on the wall. That was what that was primarily used for, and it's pretty much obsolete. Nobody makes that anymore. And there's one or two companies that do make it, but I found them to be uncooperative in terms of using audiophile materials, so we essentially had to buy the machinery to make this type of conductor with audiophile grade materials like higher grade copper, and the center core essentially in these phone cord kind of cables was usually nylon, which is horrible for audio. So basically it's a thin foil spiral wrapped around a non-conductive core, and in most cases that was a solid core, which also was no good. So we had to come up with a way of using PE fibers for the core, and then wrapping a high-grade copper foil around it and then insulation over that. So that gave us the high frequencies. So the rest of the whole art of this was in figuring out how many solid conductors and what gauges, with a flat conductor, and then how many spiral ribbon conductors would result in a fully balanced sounding cable. It took many years to finalize that and to perfect it. There were a lot of samples made, a lot of trial and error, and it went on for about 10 years, really, before it got distilled down to what Clarus is today. And that's essentially the history of it.